On behalf of ZAMWI board, welcome to the first ZAMWI Zoom talk of 2022. Stay tuned for more to come, obviously. Before we begin, a reminder to save the date of March 26th for a special Nowruz open house at the Cameron Diary. More information will follow. We have a very special treat today with a talk by a renowned scholar joining us from France. Her talk is titled Nowruz, Persia's Great Spring Festival. I will introduce ZAMWI's own Dr. Pashna Manshi, host of today's talk, who will then introduce our very special guest. Dr. Pashna Manshi is Associate Clinical Director of Stem Cell Transplant and Cell Immunotherapy Program at MedStar Georgetown University Hospital. She is board certified in hematology and oncology, and she's also assistant professor of medicine at Georgetown University. She's also very dedicated and what do you call it? Dedicated and active volunteer in ZAMWI community, serve as a teacher in our Avesta classes, and also chair of ZAMWI's Arts and Culture Council. And Dr. Manshi will produce our guest, host the talk, and Q&A today. Pashna, many thanks. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zarir, and for that lovely, kind introduction. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rachna Reiter and introduce her rather illustrious biography and background. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Reiter is a political scientist and has worked as a political analyst. She began her career as a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and then began to be a contributing editor of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Handbook of Strategic Policy. And subsequently, she was head of global risks for a leading strategic risk consultancy in the UK, where she specialized in advising Lloyd's of London syndicate specialty insurance underwriters on political risk, war and terrorism risk. And she's a senior advisor to some of the major British, Austrian and German companies as well as occasionally she has spoken on strategic risk issues on CNBC, Bloomberg and Reuters television. In addition to this, she's had an illustrious parallel career in academia. She's been the author of Contemporary Zoroastrians, An Unstructured Nation in 1994, co-author with Shahrukh of the Memoirs of Kehkashroo Shahrukh in 1994, and authors of The Reshaping of Iran from Zoroastrian to Muslim in 2013. In 2021, she produced the audiobook, The Story of Zoroastrians, A Historical Perspective, which is available on her website, rachnareiter.com. She has lectured on ancient Iranian history at Birkbeck College and at Richmond College, both in London. She was a research assistant at Manchester University, where she undertook work on the Zoroastrian community in the United Kingdom. From 2008 to 2019, Dr. Reiter was the senior teaching fellow in the Department of Studies of Religions, School of Oriental and African Studies, known as SOAS, in London University. And there she lectured on Zoroastrianism in ancient and modern worlds. She has participated at international conferences, lectured in the UK, USA, and in India on Iranian history. Among her many awards were a Commonwealth Scholarship in the 1970s and a Fellowship of the British Institute of Persian Studies in 1988. She was also a member of the National Employment Panel from 2006 to 2007, which was commissioned by Britain's then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, before his elevation to the office of Prime Minister. She holds a doctorate from the London School of Economics and International Relations. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Reiter, who joins us all the way from France. And thank you so much for giving us a talk today on Nowruz. So please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ZAMWI Zooms, which I think is a wonderful idea. And I echo what Dolly said, Nowruz Mubarak, well in advance to everybody. I've prepared a short talk on Nowruz because actually there is much more to the evolution of this great festival than many of us Zoroastrians know. Before I even start, it reminds me, I think in 2009 or 2010, the Persian Society at SOAS, that's London University where I was lecturing, invited me to talk to them on Nowruz. And the Persian Society is made up almost exclusively of Iranian students. And I would suggest that they were all Iranian Muslim students. And so I went in the evening, on this assigned evening, and spoke to them on Nowruz. And as Iranians, they were absolutely thrilled to hear about Nowruz. But what struck me was that they were all students, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, in their respective spheres. And all of them were surprised at the deep Zoroastrian roots of Nowruz. It really, really struck me. It really struck a chord with me. And all their questions were about this great linkage between Nowruz and Zoroastrianism, the theology of Zoroastrianism. So let us examine, if you like, the story behind Nowruz. And I think that amongst the most auspicious days in the calendar of Iranian peoples and their descendants is March the 21st, Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which has come to symbolize the Iranian peoples and harks back to when Iran was Zoroastrian. Indeed, the antiquity of Nowruz is very integral to Persian mythology. We are told that the mythical King Jamshid, blessed with the fiery Izadi, the divine glory that gave him his famous throne on which he sat like the shining sun, ruled the world during a golden age. To celebrate this event, the festival of Nowruz was introduced, and on this day, the world gathered around the king's throne, paid homage to him, and celebrated with wine and music and dance. The Zoroastrian tradition informs us that the festival was founded by Zarathustra himself, who, it is held, received his revelation on Nowruz. Zarathustra is thought to have imposed only two obligations on his followers: the individual one of prayer 5 times a day, which is the Kasti Bastan, when we tie and untie our Kasti, and the communal celebration of the 7 seasonal festivals, the Gahambars. The 7 high feasts are dedicated to the creator Ahura Mazda and the 7 creations, the Amesha Shpentas. Now, the Amesha Shpentas are translated in English as the bounteous or the holy immortals. And these Amesha Shpentas perform a dual role. They form the kernel, the very core of the ethical infrastructure of the Zoroastrian doctrine, and are the guardians and protectors of the 7 good creations: sky, water, earth, plants, cattle, man, and fire. The 7th festival is the last convivial occasion of the old year and marks the start of the new year, and hence came to be known later as Nowruz, the new day. Springtime in the cycle of life is an important period as it represents the annual resurgence of life. As such, it is deemed to be a day of renewal, of hope, and joy. There are, as would be expected, legends attached to such an ancient festival. And it is said that history began from Nowruz, when the sun first moved across the horizon. It is a joyous new beginning to the year, and according to the Shahnameh, it is a day for reconciliations. So let's return to the story of Jamshid, often referred to in old texts as Yima. He's often referred to interchangeably as Yima and Jamshid. And his name is now associated with Nowruz. Myth is often more powerful than reality. And this mythical Yima, Jamshid, is an enduring part of Zoroastrian mythology. But his was a checkered career. In Zoroastrian texts, such as the ZAMWI Zooms, he ends his long tenure underground and is brought back with his subjects to the earth's surface in the final days of humanity. In other words, his realm stretched from the bowels of the earth while his spirit soared into paradise. There is a reference to Yima in the Gathas. In Yasna 32, verse 8, we are told, even Yima, the son of Vivahant, was condemned for such sins. Now, this suggests that he was linked to religious practices Zarathustra disapproved of. The Jamyad-Yasht, which is a Pahlavi text, the Jamyad-Yasht refers to Yima's supposed transgressions. We are told that the druj, which means the lie, entered his mind, and that his qarena, his royal fortune, deserted him, leaving him vulnerable. But Jamshid's reputation was rescued by Ferdowsi, and the Shahnameh vividly recounts the contest for kingship between Jamshid and the arch-villain in Iranian literature. And we know the arch-villain in Iranian literature is Zohak. Jamshid's legacy endures. In fact, Persepolis is perhaps incorrectly referred to as Takht-i-Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid. What a career trajectory he had. His journey takes him from condemnation in the Gathas right through to his elevation as the very model of kingship. He remains the most famous of the legendary Pishtadian kings, the very apogee, the very height of kingship, who presided over the golden age of humanity. And so we are told that Jamshid, quote, stripped the demons of their power over humanity, and with God's glory and power was raised up to the sky on a couch so that he could go down into hell and investigate other demonic creatures. It was to celebrate this legendary accomplishment credited to Jamshid that inaugurated Nowruz, hence Jamshidi Nowruz. Now to return to recorded history. The Achaemenid dynasty were rulers of a great empire, and not surprisingly, the kings had several residences. Darius built a new palace of great magnificence at Persepolis, which is in Pars, southern Iran, and Pars was the home province of the Achaemenish family. And this became the symbolic home of this branch, Darius's branch of the dynasty. Now, this palace at Persepolis is raised on a stone platform overlooking a broad plain, was extended and enriched through successive reigns. Xenophon's description of Nowruz celebrations at Persepolis confirms its importance in the Achaemenid royal calendar. Among its many splendors are superb carvings up its wide stairways, showing processions of soldiers, courtiers, and peoples of the empire, Persians, Medes, other Iranians, Indians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, etc., peoples of this vast empire. The representatives of these people come bearing offerings, and it is thought that this procession represents the annual bringing of gifts to the King of Kings at the Nowruz feast. Now, along this staircase, which represents all the peoples of the empire bringing their gifts, includes all sorts of people. But what is very interesting, there is a representation, because from the time of Darius, what is northwest India was another satrapi. It was conquered by the Persians. And so you see the Indian representative on the Apadana. He's barefoot and he wears a skirt, which those of us who have lived in India and come from India know as the dhoti. So the Indian representative along the Apadana is represented wearing a dhoti. After the Achaemenid era, we move on to the Arshid Parthian era. And we have very specific references to the celebration of Nowruz during the reign of King Valkash I. And his era is between 51 and 78 AD. During the Parthian era, a collateral branch of the royal Arshid family ruled Armenia. In fact, Armenia, because of this, was very much the cockpit of wars between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. Given the Zoroastrian influence at the very highest levels of Armenian society, it is not surprising that Nowruz was celebrated there as well. During the Sasanian dynasty, from its very inception under Ardashir I, Nowruz was not just celebrated, but declared the most important day of the year. In fact, traditions set in place under this dynasty, such as granting royal audience, giving cash gifts, pardoning prisoners, inaugurated under the Sasanians, endured long after them. We learn from Pahlavi texts, Middle Persian texts, that there was much emphasis on the significance of spring in connection with thoughts of renovation of the world. This is where the Zoroastrian theological depth of Nowruz comes in, because it speaks to the renovation of the world, which in Avestan we know of as Frashokerati, in Pahlavi as Freshigid. So there is the Pahlavi text Zatspram, and let us hear what it has to say about it. It says, the making of Freshigid is like the year in which at springtime the trees are made to blossom. Like the resurrection of the dead, new leaves are made to shoot from dry plants and trees, and springtime is made to blossom. So this is how Zatspram describes Nowruz. So there is a sense of renewal, which now becomes characteristic of Nowruz. And new clothes are worn, food of the new season is cooked and eaten. Among other things which is thought propitious to begin this day with was a mouthful of pure fresh milk and fresh cheese. All the kings of Persia took it as a blessing. So what did the kings eat? What did the king eat on the morning of Nowruz? He ate white sugar with fresh Indian nuts pared. There is a reference from the Parthian era to the celebration of Nowruz in this very famous poem, Visuramin, and it paints a picture. Though the king's banquet was splendid, others were no less so. Everyone had gone from his house to the country. From every garden, field, and river, a different variety of music charmed the year. And it was the custom, as much in times long past as it remains to this day, to sow for this seventh feast 7 kinds of seeds to come up fresh and green on Nowruz itself. For the king, the sight of growing barley was particularly deemed a blessing, and the harvest of these green shoots was never gathered but with songs and music and mirth. So the Persians were always given to living the good life. There is an account by a Muslim scholar written on the basis of Zoroastrian sources in the late 9th century. It's quite a big excerpt, but I thought I'd share it with you. So let's listen to what it says. When the king had donned his attire and joined his assembly, there came to him a man, pleasant of name, experienced in luck, joyful of face, and quick of tongue. He stood facing the king and said, "Give me leave to come in." "Who are you?" asked the king. The man replied, "My name is Khojeshte. With me, the new year approaches. I have brought a good news and greetings and a message for the king." So the king said, "Give him leave." And to the man he said, "Come in." Then he put before the king a table of silver containing cakes baked in different kinds of seed, wheat, barley, millet, sorghum, peas, lentils, rice, sesame, beans, and kidney beans. From each sort, 7 grains were taken and put on the table's sides, while in the middle of it, they put 7 branches of trees, which were deemed auspicious, and whose aspect was thought a blessing, such as the willow, the olive, the quince tree, and the pomegranate tree. Besides, they put on this table 7 white earthen plates, 7 white dirhams of the year's coinage, and a new dinar. Dinar, as we know, was a coin. All this the king accepted, while the messenger called on his head eternal life, unceasing kingdom, bliss, and power. All this day, the king abstained from discussing any matter, fearing lest something unpleasant should come of it, and hid the whole year. The first thing brought before the king was a vase of gold or silver containing white sugar with fresh Indian nuts paired, and bowls of silver and gold. On each of the Nowruz days, they set a white falcon flying. Among other things which it was thought propitious to begin this day with was a mouthful of pure fresh milk and fresh cheese. All the kings of Persia took it as a blessing. End note. This then is the genesis of the Hafsin table, so emblematic of Nowruz itself, composed of the 7 S's in the Persian alphabet. Each family dresses its Hafsin table to correspond to the 7 Amesha Shventas. So, what are the Hafsin items? Those of you from Iran know this well, but we need to refresh our memory. So you have sabze, which is wheat or barley growing in a dish, and that symbolizes rebirth. Then you have saman, which is a sweet pudding made from wheat germ, which speaks to affluence. Then you have senjed, which is dried fruit, symbolizing love. You have sir, which is garlic, which is medicinal. Then you have sib, which are apples, signifying beauty and health. Sumac, which are the sumac berries, which reflect sunrise. And serke, vinegar, which Parsis will pronounce as sarko, serke, which represents age and patience. Now, in addition, a few coins representing prosperity, a basket of painted eggs for fertility, candles for enlightenment, a flask of rose water known for its magical power, a prayer book, the Avesta, and a picture of the prophet Zarathustra in Zoroastrian homes will adorn the table. When the visitor enters the house, he or she will look into a mirror, and this mirror represents the images, the reflections of the creation as we celebrate anew the Zoroastrian traditions and beliefs that creation took place on the first day of spring. So we look into a mirror and you get a few drops of rose water in the palm of your hand for its cleansing power. However, well before the actual day itself, preparations get underway. I can recall this growing up in India when my mother would start the house spring clean ahead of Nowruz. And this spring cleaning in Iran is translated as shaking the house. And it sets the scene for the festivities to follow. And of course, new clothes are bought, especially for children. And I can remember that we had to wear a new sudre, especially, at least a new sudre, on the day itself. In Iran, the Nowruz holiday stretches for a fortnight. It is not a luxury that we enjoyed in India, nor in the Western diaspora. And on the eve of Nowruz, the fire festival, Charshanbe Shuri, is celebrated. Making memories for children during this very significant date has meant that in Iran, but again, sadly not in India, Amu Nowruz would bring gifts for children. In fact, he is thought to be the precursor of Santa Claus, an old man with a long white beard and a long cloak. And he has a companion, Haji Firuz, whose face and hands are covered in soot, and he is dressed in red and plays a tambourine. All are very joyous aspects of the festival. So the small group of Zoroastrians domiciled in India and known as Parsis, I'm referring to ourselves, have for generations celebrated Jamshidi Nowruz in their distinctive way. The day begins with a visit to the fire temple, before which the family has breakfasted on bravo, which is semolina pudding, or save, which is vermicelli pudding, followed by a typically auspicious lunch of rice, dar, and fish bhatia, which is the famous dhan dar patio. Let me share a story with you about dhan dar patio, which has no relevance to Nowruz whatsoever. I think it was around 2012 or so, Prince Philip, the Queen's husband, was invited and spent almost half a day at the Zoroastrian Center in London. And it was a very well organized day. It was a wonderful affair and a very successful event. And Prince Philip was invited for lunch and he stayed to lunch. And I think that the ZTFE made a very intelligent decision. Prince Philip had lunch with about 10 or 12 young Zoroastrians. And apparently on the menu was dhan dar patio. One of the ladies who was serving the lunch, and I spoke to her after that, I said, how did it go? She said, he enjoyed it. He said he was picking up the last pieces of rice with his fingers and eating it. So he absolutely cleared the plate. So there is something to be said for the traditional dhan dar patio. I digress, but I always think it speaks to it. The Parsis, however, as we know, do not traditionally now prepare a half-sing table, but instead they have the sais, which is a silver tray, and it is dressed with a container of rose water, betel nut, a handful of raw rice, sugar, flowers, a picture of Zarathustra, small representative Afghania, which is the silver urn, which holds a small fire nourished by sandalwood and other fragrant resins. While variations in the celebration of Nowruz may have occurred among peoples of Iran dispersed by time and place, the durability of the festival itself is remarkable. The central role of Nowruz in Iranian people's affections meant that following the introduction of Islam to Iran from the 7th century AD, the new rulers found that they could not dislodge this essentially Zoroastrian festival. In fact, Nowruz was honored even by the early founders of Islam. Significantly, while the new rulers of Iran were prepared to countenance, in fact, they had no choice in the matter. They had to retain Nowruz and the midwinter celebration of Sadeh. So these two very intrinsically Zoroastrian festivals survived. But the Gahambars, Mehergan, Tirgan, which are immensely important dates in the Zoroastrian calendar, were gradually dropped and only observed by Zoroastrians. There are records of the 4 great caliphs presiding over Nowruz celebrations. And Nowruz was the main royal holiday during the Abbasid era. It is very significant that the Abbasid caliphs, they governed their empire from Baghdad. The Degans would offer gifts to the caliphs and local rulers on Nowruz. So who are the Degans? They were part of the Iranian provincial administrative structure whose position became entrenched in the Sasanian era. This was a very large class of local administrators who came in time to act as tax collectors. The Arabs found them to be the very backbone of local government. In fact, they couldn't do without them. Following the demise of the Caliphate, the subsequent elevation and re-emergence of Persian dynasties, especially the Samanids and the Buyids, elevated Nowruz to an even higher level. The Buyids revived the ancient traditions of Sasanian times and restored many smaller celebrations that had been eliminated by the Caliphate. The best known Buyid ruler, Abd ad-Dawla, sat on his throne at court as the astronomer came forward to kiss the ground and offer congratulations on the new year. The setting for this was, of course, a splendidly decorated hall with gold and silver plates and vases of fruit and colorful vegetables and flowers and fruit and music and song and dance and general bonhomie. And Nowruz was a joyous occasion then, as in previous years. When the Seljuk Turks conquered Iran, in 1079 AD, a group of 8 scholars led by Omar Khayyam calculated and established the Jalili calendar, computing the year starting from Nowruz. Thus, even the Turkish and Mongol invaders of Iran did not attempt to abolish Nowruz in favor of any other celebration, which helps explain the totemic significance of the great celebration, which is more widespread than is generally believed. Countries that were once territories of or influenced by the Persian Empire, ranging from modern-day Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the Kurds of Syria, of Turkey, of Iraq, Iran, the Uyghurs in northwestern China, all have their distinctive Nowruz celebration to welcome the spring equinox on March the 21st. Now, a few years ago, I traveled to Uzbekistan. My husband and I took a journey to Uzbekistan, a country all but forgotten by many Zoroastrians as an early repository of the faith. Khiva, which is located in ancient Khwarezmia, Bukhara, Samarkand, which is located in ancient Sogdia, Sogd, are a treasure trove of the history of Zoroastrianism. The Afrasiab wall paintings depict 7th century AD Sogdian murals, discovered very recently, 1965, in a building in the residential area of ancient Samarkand. In what is referred to as the Hall of the Ambassadors, the foreigners depicted are presenting gifts to the local King Varkuman and his queen during Nowruz celebrations. The foreigners are possibly ambassadors who traveled to Samarkand to honor the local king. Staying in Uzbekistan, which is now a Muslim nation, Nowruz was legitimized by prayers at mosques, visits to the mazars of Muslim saints, and to sacred streams. That's extremely interesting. Here in France, where we live, there is a travel agency which organizes tours to Uzbekistan specifically during Nowruz. They are called Nowruz trips to Uzbekistan. So we are not surprised that Nowruz continues to be celebrated in countries associated with Iran or part of Greater Iran in ancient times. But what comes as a surprise, what came to me as a surprise, was when I took a look at this. When Hyderabad was a princely state, Hyderabad is located in the Deccan Plateau. In this part of India, the Nizam of Hyderabad, the ruler of Hyderabad, at one time, the Nizam of Hyderabad was thought to be the richest man in the world. The Nizam of Hyderabad celebrated Nowruz as one of 4 national holidays when he would hold a public darbar. This definitely came as a surprise to me. So what began essentially as a celebration of the Zoroastrian year, associated with the 7th creation of fire, which in turn is linked to Asha Bahishta, the best truth, a festival celebrated by Iran's monarchs and their subjects, came to be so rooted in the affections of the Iranian nation that it was impossible to dislodge from the calendar. Indeed, the genius of Nowruz, as we know it, is the universality and secularity of its message, man's aim of Rashokerati, of Ahura Mazda's good creation, symbolized by the spring equinox, marking the end of winter and the refreshing of the season. I think that's it for now. Thank you.